Can you hear me? Oh, now I can hear me. Now I can hear myself. Okay. Bueno, my name is Roberto Marquez, and I want to begin by saying how grateful I am and thankful both to be invited once again to be a part of something at Word Up, as I was last year when they did the symposium on Pedro Mil, and to be witness to such penetrating and beautifully presented the considerations of our new poet today. And to be a part of the group that does that, I consider an honor, and I want to express that. Again, what I'm going to do is I am one of those people who doesn't trust themselves unless they put it down. So I will be reading my presentation, and I've titled it The Transcreations, okay, of Rhina Espaillat. Translation, especially of poetry, is an authentically creative art. The real thing and genuine article has effectively to transcend and always goes well beyond mere transliteration or any simple, more or less accurate description of a text's meaning from one into another language or alphabet. As singularly imaginative and inventive, as complexly exacting as a good solo improvisation by any player in a great jazz ensemble, its successful accomplishment likewise reflects, and at its best unobtrusively testifies to a subtle sense and finely honed sensibility of necessary craft and artful skill, of no less keen or compelling than that required by any other art. All too often, it is regarded by some as a secondary, relatively minor realization. The true nature and caliber of its achievement simply is also as often taken for granted, because properly accomplished, it is so understatedly, even invisibly achieved. It was, though, precisely these qualities of art and originality which ultimately led the Brazilian writer Heraldo Campos, in search of a term more fully accurate and descriptively suitable to the case than translation, to offer up transcreation as a term much more appropriate and apt to it. What Etheridge Knight, the Afro-American poet, so rightly and so the dozens like declared about the poetic form of haiku, making jazz swing in 17 syllables ain't no square poet's job, applies no less to translation. It's no square writer's job. And Rhina P. Espaillat is no square writer or poet. Stressing her perception of poetry, and I quote, chiefly as a musical delight, and in an image that can bring to mind the witty quipped about Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire's dazzling synchrony as dancers, to the effect that, as he might well get the lion's share of credit, she, still more strikingly and impressively, did it all simultaneously in reverse, in heels, and dancing backwards. Rhina Espaillat is clearly more than just passingly aware and intimately familiar with everything the true act of translation entails. Regarding it, in fact, as, and I quote, the shared art of writing backwards, end of quote, her comments on its demands similarly draw attention to and lucidly accentuate its many demands and essentials, no less than the range of bilingual, bicultural realities are its ordinary stomping ground and operational context. It works backwards, she writes, because what you translate doesn't come from your inner being, but from someone else's. Translating involves first grasping that other person's experience, feeling, perception, insight, and thought before you try to recreate it in a new other poem composed in another language. End of quote. Ultimately, she concludes, translation is the never completely satisfactory art shared by two different mental processes, employing the poet's method in reverse, but meant to achieve poetry, and I underline, but meant to achieve poetry, capable of crossing the language barriers that divide us. It is the signal achievement of that transcending passage. It's, with any luck, instantaneous, seemingly unmediated, direct and fraternal human communication that is translation's holy grail. It is the pursuit of the concurrently effective and affective crossing of those barriers that divide us, end quote, which lies at authentic translation's vital core. To the extent any given language is as well, always, invariably a vibrant cornucopia of coexisting miscellaneous languages, vernaculars, dialects, variations, etc., and specific individual and collective experience, the writing of poetry in any particular one itself, she also astutely notes, ultimately emerges as something analogous, and in any event, not entirely unlike a process of translation, and the bi- or multilingual demands on her or his artistic resources and creativity which any bona fide translator must inevitably face. Rhina indeed very clearly and incisively declares, there is a sense in which every poet is bilingual, and those of us who are more covertly so are only living metaphors for the condition that applies to us all. We use a language that seems deceptively like the language of the people around us, but it isn't quite. The words are the same, but the weight we give them, the criteria we use to choose this one rather than that one, are our own. As a poet of her own originals in two languages, her incomparably singular verse consistently argues its author's will to style, deft formal skill, lithe suppleness, and nimble agility of craft. Her poetry's discrete intricacies, and careful precisions of form, language, and overall practice regularly endow it with a quite special, vividly lyrical power. The grace and elegance of its characteristic voice, tone, and serene, unassuming delivery, its thus hard-won vernacular accessibility and conversational ease, no less than its meditatively reflective poignancies and lingering resonance, give still further breadth, reach, and dimension to that power's commanding force and reverberation. Her poetry's snapshot captures of the intimacies and meaningful, inexorable fleeting moments of ordinary personal, domestic, and family life, the epic, if you will, of everyday living and experience, is just one among its various signature modalities. Its assayings and embrace of our mortality's enduring paradoxes and contradictions, elegiac ironies and ambiguities, are so many more features of its recurring themes. The inexorable passage of time and not entirely uncomplicated consolations of memory's nostalgias, as well as something like the air of what Unamuno defined as el sentimiento trágico de la vida, still further amplifies and enlarges its several thematic provinces. Agua de dos ríos, poemas, prosas y traducciones, una colección bilingüe, Water from Two Rivers, poems and prose translations especially, provides us with something like a broadly synoptic capsule synthesis, if you will, of Rhina's artistic personality, broad reach, and achievement as a rare two-language poet and translator. One is right off struck by the collection's title. More than one contemporary Latino, Nuyorican, or especially Spanglish language poet might have more typically inclined to a heightening of the reader's immediately palpable sense and appreciation of the dynamic fusion, if sometimes conflictive blending of tongues, comes of the at once clashing and confluent waves of his or her linguistic inheritance and legacy. The title of Tato Laviera's collection, American, re-inflected and reconfigured to Am American, Soy Americano, okay, comes to mind. Even as her title evokes and points to these particular waters' sustaining essence and indispensability, the two rivers here, one no less a vital aqua vitae to her than the other, do not appear to be in tension, and significantly preserve wholly intact their own distinct integrity and separate identity. They each evidently flow and their currents run along parallel rather than convergent and ultimately confluent courses. Translation, that regular crossing over from one river of language to the other, is then de rigor, unavoidable, effectively an obligatory identitarian and personal life necessity. It is finally in Rita and in Rhina herself and in her work that they ultimately meet, come together, and converge, even as they otherwise retain their own distinctive character and personality. The collection itself is organized and structured to reflect and demonstrate the pivotal centrality of this perception. It is, in effect, divided into two major overarching subdivisions, each in turn divided into respectively 4 and 2 further subdivisions. The first of its two overarching organizational segments is composed of Rhina's own original work in her two languages and in different modalities, with companion translations. There are that are always also the work of her own hand. It begins with an initial initial section of 12 poems, first composed or originally composed in Spanish with their facing page English translations. A following second subsection adds another 6 poems, originally written in English with their accompanying and facing page Spanish translations. A third subsection of several essays of generally autobiographical prose written in both languages, end quote, okay, follows. The last and most extensive subsection of this more general subdivision offers its reader, and I quote, a collection of poems written in English, period. Many included here from earlier collections. Okay. The emphasis here, of course, is on Rhina's own varied and ample aura, in whichever language. The translations here are all her own work, of her own work. If, as the author of these translations, it may arguably be said that she begins with something of an advantage over any other possible translator of her work with respect to the relative depth and confidence of her knowing any given poem's initial motivation and primary overall intent, this does not in the least lessen to any appreciable degree the other still remaining difficulties of her task as a translator. It certainly does not in any way diminish the truly exceptional quality of the finished second, no less original poems that she here regularly produces as such. Her achievement as a translator, the lyrical ingenuity, prosodic inventiveness, and originality of its genuinely poetic, and I underline that, genuinely poetic crossover here is in any event exceptional and strikingly impressive. Putting a specific spotlight on the ample spectrum of her work as translator of the work of other authors, the collection's second overarching subdivision, the general division, by contrast, offers us the abundant variety of the many other poets whose verse she has been moved to translate. Whatever possible advantage being herself the author of any given original text to be translated, clearly no longer operative here, it is in these two subsections that the really gold medal Olympic stature and virtuoso distinction of her translators swim in her two rivers of language most clearly and unambiguously show to their full best advantage and effect. The first of these two subsections presents us with poems by other authors in Spanish, translated into English. The next, original poems by other authors in English, translated into Spanish. The scope, historical sweep, and diversity of authors and translations included is as integrally and broadly eclectic as it is in sync with their translators' own otherwise signature concerns, poetic passions, and expressive proclivities. Its compass extends from the spiritual and Baroque precincts of 16th and 17th century Spain, the English Elizabethans, and Victorian England into the more contemporary sphere of the 20th century and even more immediately recent times. It includes already well-known and long canonic figures, such as San Juan de la Cruz, George Herbert, and Gerard Manley Hopkins, Mexico's Fray Miguel de Guevara and Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, as well as now classic authors from the Dominican Republic, such as Manuel del Cabral, and a generous sampling of some of its younger bards of more recent vintage and diasporic times, like Juan Matos, Cesar Sanchez Veras, and Yolanda Hernandez, among others. It is an uncommonly various panorama and more than usually translator-challenging mix. The translations here are, for all that, simply and generally superb, and put on splendid display Rhina Espaillat's uncommon gifts and talents as a translator and the two-language real thing. One all the more regrets that in these two closing sections, the original texts on immediately facing pages are not provided. The masterful caliber and distinction of the translation's renditions and achievement would have thereby been all the more immediately evident, doubly striking, and palpably luminous. By way of confirmation and conclusion, I offer the following examples. Because I went looking for the originals, the English was so stunning that I had to see what the originals look like. And so I pasted them in my copy, if I can just find it for 1 second. Here it is. Okay. I'm going to take it, in the book what you come on is To Christ Crucified. That's the title of the thing. This is by Miguel de Guevara, born 1585, about to 1646. The original reads as follows. And remember, the reader of the English doesn't see this original. This is crucial, I think, for you to see what has happened here. Okay? This is the original. No me mueve mi Dios para quererte. El cielo que me tienes prometido. No me mueve mi Dios para quererte. El cielo que me tienes prometido. Ni me mueve el infierno tan temido para dejar por eso de ofenderte. Tú me mueves, Señor. Muéveme el verte clavado en una cruz y escarnecido. Muéveme ver tu cuerpo y tan herido. Muéveme tus afrentas y tu muerte. Muéveme, en fin, tu amor, y en tal manera que aunque no hubiera cielo, yo te amara, y aunque no hubiera infierno, te temiera. No tienes que me dar, oye, no tienes que me dar, no darme. No tienes que me dar porque te quiera, pues aunque cuanto espero no esperara, lo mismo que te quiero, te quisiera. That in Spanish is kick-ass, excuse me. Okay. It is absolutely kick. Okay. This is the English. I am not moved, my God, by what you've sworn. The heaven promised me to love you well. Nor am I moved by fearful thoughts of hell, and to offend you more with sin and scorn. It is you, Lord, who move me. You so torn by mockery and torture that befell your body on the cross. Those wounds that tell of injuries endured, the death you've borne. It is your love at last that moves me so, that I should love you were not heaven true, and fear you were all hell an empty show. I need no gifts to make me cherish you, for were each hope betrayed that faith can know, I should adore you still, as now I do.
Not bad.
That too is kick-ass. Okay? Three things just to say on the fly quickly. One, okay, it gets the meaning exact, not maybe. Okay? But it doesn't go only to the meaning. It goes to the music. And it gets the music as if it were an orchestra, man. I mean, it's dynamite. And I say that because I translate a lot and I know what it means to get there. Okay. And thirdly, when she comes on something that's quite transparent, you know, in the original language, but doesn't work in the other language, she finds a maneuver to get around it and make it work in the other language as if it's not a maneuver.
Sneaky.
Exactly. It's sneaky, but it's slick, man. You know. Okay, so that's one. That's in Spanish. Now I'm going to take one from her English correction. And I was torn between which one to grab, so I'll just do it, in this case, a la tirada, so to speak. And take another 17th century dude here, George Herbert. This is an Englishman, okay? 1593 to 1633, okay? The original poem is called Sour Sweet, and it's spelled S-O-W-R-E, okay, in the original. Sour Sweet, George Herbert. Ah, my dear angry Lord, since thou dost love, yet strike, cast down, yet help afford. Ah, my dear angry Lord, since thou dost love, yet strike, cast down, yet help afford. Sure, I will do the like. I will complain, yet praise. I will bewail, approve. And all my sour sweet days I will lament and love. Okay? This is the Spanish. 20th century, 21st century, okay, from the 17th, from the 16th, okay. Agridulce. Dios mío, enojado, amado, que das amor y castigo, que amparas al desdichado, en eso tu ejemplo sigo. He de quejarme alabando, he de gemir consintiendo, agridulce iré pasando, mis días clamando y queriendo. Eso es un español exquisito, accesible, encantador. Yeah. Y no se lee como traducción. Eso se lee como que si escribió original. Okay. And I make my case.
Qué bueno.
Gracias.
I am so honored to be here today en frente de ay, no doña, no, Rhina. Like to be called doña at all. And I'm Sarah Ponte, and I'm here as the librarian of the house. Everybody here is a poet or a critical literature person, professor from literature, but I'm the librarian. And I'm here because I had the great honor of working with Rhina a couple of years ago in putting together a book that was going to be the first time that the writings of one of the Dominican founding people, no, let's say people, because we have women.
My bad.
Sí. I'm trying to avoid that. Los padres de la patria, no. Gente que hizo la patria. Because women were part of that too. So,
Get into trouble.
never, I know, he's my profe querido. So, this idea came about in 2013. December, we got together for the first time as a group. The idea was to translate some of the writings of Juan Pablo Duarte. Why? Because people used to quote him and talk about him, but some of these people never read his writings. They were like quoting other people's ideas about his writing, and especially in English. So for us was a very important contribution to take a selection of those writings and translate them. So we're like, oh, who is going to be the best person to do this? Who is? Our very own Rhina Espaillat. And then we contacted her, and she said yes right away. And that was the money involved, because it was a project of love. We also commissioned young people, undergraduate and graduate students, to work with Rhina.
Wonderful young people.
Yes. And then I came in as the librarian, trying to coordinate the group, help with the compilation of the project, but they were the one who did all the work. And today I'm here to talk about that, about la grandeza de Rhina in this project. These were kids. They didn't know much about translation, about language, the way she does. And then the way she treated them was like, when they sent her these drafts, and I have some copies, because as a librarian, I always keep those. Those are archival sources. And if you see them, and I have an example that I brought here, because I want you to see this. This is an email, right? And in the email, she writes. I'm writing first, okay? And then he is talking about a letter that was written from Juan Pablo Duarte to General Oquendo, hijo. And then he puts that, Antonio, who was a translator of this, wrote that. He said, I am translating the letter written to General Oquendo, hijo. And what does Rhina do? Junior. Because he's writing in English, right? The email just begins right there. And then this is the way she did. And then she writes all these notes. And the beauty of this is that she scans this. And she sends this via email to the kid. She's so, how do you say that, so resourceful, right? We didn't meet only twice. And we worked for 2 years and a half on this book. And it was all via email. But that warmth, that love, that respect, you felt it. And for example, I want to show you something. An email that I sent to the group summarizing what we're talking about. And I sent all translations to Rhina, double space, along with a note stating why you chose that particular piece. Rhina will go through these notes and include some quotes in the introduction of the book. It was not only translate this and that's it. No, she wanted to know why you chose that specific piece of writing. And then she wanted to know why you wanted to do it. To put your heart in there, not just a piece of paper, right? And then she says, please do not wait too long, I said that, with a draft of translation without sending it to her. Don't keep it to yourself, send it to her. She will kill it, but that's okay. That's the way it works, right?
That works.
And then advice from Rhina. One, do not translate word sentences. Translate meaning. Think about it in Spanish. How do you phrase it? Then think in both languages. Capture the meaning, the mood. Become Duarte, speaking in English. Can you imagine that? Keep anything that is emotionally valid, but to the attention span of the reader. Write straight to the point, but keep the flavor of the 19th century to a certain degree. How can you do that? Only Rhina can do that. Like you just read, that you just heard, right? And so this was one of the things that she said, right? And then she continues, and she says a lot of, and as a librarian, I'm putting this together. One day I'm going to put this publicly so people can see how you can translate following Rhina's guidelines. This is a guide of translation by itself. It has a lot of great tips and information and resource for everybody to see. So stay tuned for that. It's coming. So this is the book that came out of that project. And it was, we also have here curriculum material about the book. So people can use it in schools, different high school and middle school as well. So please do, if you know any teachers, what one of the teachers did is that he took the Constitution, the idea of the Constitution that Duarte wrote, and then parallel that to the idea of the Constitution of the United States. So bringing it to the U.S. history as well. So it's not so a separate or a foreign thing for students who are studying here in the United States. And Rhina translated one of the poems that I love the most. ¿Cuál es? ¿Usted sabe cuál será? De los que están aquí.
El exilio.
No, criollo.
Criollo.
Sí, criollo. That's the one that Duarte says that everybody is welcome. Los negros, los cobrizos, blancos, todo el mundo, everyone. It is. We usually work with kids in the library. Our library is at the City College of New York, CUNY Dominican Studies Institute, and we are an academic library. Yes, we work with these scholars. I love them all, but I love my kids too. Why? Because they're going to become these scholars one day, and we expose them to primary sources and secondary sources from a very early age. Second graders go to our library, all the way up to high school, and people from the community. So what we do is we teach them this information, but with primary sources and secondary sources, exposing them to a world of university, because we want to see them there one day. And then also we have Jensen. Jensen, where are you? Está allá escondido. Jensen is our librarian, and he works with us, putting together these workshops. But the thing is, what Rhina has done in her trajectory should be not only for adults, no, should be shared with kids. Y esos mangos que ahorita hablaron, mango confiscado, we're going to use that in one of the workshops that we have with kids soon. Okay, so that book is coming out. Rhina always donates to the library. So we're very appreciative to that. And hint to others who write. Of course, you donate to Word Doc always, but also to the Dominican Institute Library, because we have resources there for everybody to see, and we use them all the time. We have Osiris, for example, here, Manuel, and Jimmy, querido Sierra. They're great authors. Panel, we have your book too, Daniel. Well, and De La Rosa, yo me vuelvo loca aquí, ¿qué más? Mucha gente, a lot of big great people, and Torres Dayan, of course, my beloved mentor. And I know Rhina because of you, Professor. You discovered her. Tell us about that.
Do my turn.
No, it's your turn now.
Actually, no. I actually owe my first contact to Rhina Espaillat, to an anthology edited by Roberta Fernandez, a Chicana writer. Who actually had, she was trying to be inclusive. Was Latina? What is it? What is the term? Word.
In our own words.
In other words.
In other words.
In other words. And she was trying to represent. There was a time in which, if you did, Mexican descended and Puerto Rican descended, with a smattering of Cuban descended, that sufficed, even though all of the other populations were here. But eventually we broke through that, and Roberta in 1994 was trying to be inclusive, and she found a Dominican, because this was an Anglophone. The collection was of Anglophone Latina writers, and she found Rhina, and then I was connected with the university institution that published the book because I was a member of their organization, and so that's where I found it, and then I said, oh my God. Yes. Well, how come nobody knows? How come Dominicans don't know about this? And then we made sure that Dominicans knew about it, and other Latinos, because the fact is that this, in spite of her exceptional accomplishments and prestige in American poetry, she was late, to the eyes of Latinos in general. Latinos did not discover her until relatively recently. Yeah. So there.
Yeah, and that's why I'm so thrilled to show the world about her work. And that was in the late 1990s when that happened. You used to be the director of the institute.
Yes. So then we hosted a book launch for the T.S. Eliot Poetry Prize collection, winning collection, which is called Where Horizons Go.
Yes, but I want to say something, and that is that the young people who worked under my tutelage were fantastic. They were full of enthusiasm. They were full of respect for the work they were translating. They didn't mind that I drew red lines through so much of what they worked hard on. They didn't care. They understood that I meant well, and I'm sure that they had some swearing to do while I was not present. But it didn't make any difference. They learned so much, and they learned so happily, and they did so well. And I gave them, I confess, I kept the good parts for myself. I translated his poetry. They translated the letters from him to others and the other way around. They translated all the political writing, the hard stuff, the not musical stuff. I kept the dessert. So they really deserve the credit for this book. Because they were wonderful, and I miss them.
We should meet. We should do a get together soon and invite you all to come and share with us. But this is a legacy that we have from you, and
That's one of the prides of my life.
ay Dios, tú te imaginas esto, yo me muero aquí mismo. It's too much. It's an honor, really, to have worked with you and to learn so much from you every single day. And whenever I see your name, I'm like, ay, tú te imaginas, my name is next to you. Pero I really wanted her name to be by herself there because she really deserved it. I am so thrilled and happy to be here today. And then we can continue the conversation, but this was I didn't have anything written down because I couldn't. It needed to come from my heart. And because this book came from the heart. And everything will be shared. So gracias a todos y gracias a ustedes.
So I think it's my turn. I want, after I say this, Daniela has promised that she will assist us technically by playing some for us. And basically, I recently discovered the Library of Congress Poetry and Literature Center, which I had never had any need to rely on that resource. So it's a center that fosters and enhances the public's appreciation of literature. To this end, it is connected with the consultant, the poetry, the poet laureate, and all of that. Organizes events. One of the things that it does is something called the Poetry of America Initiative, which is a collection of field recordings by a wide range of award-winning contemporary poets, in which poets of note are asked to select one favorite poem by a favorite poet of theirs, and then read it, and then comment on it. And the idea is that each poet reads a singular American poem of his or her choosing, and also speaks to how the poem connects, deepens, or reimagines our sense of the nation. And this is how Rhina decided to proceed. She chose a poem by a Dominican immigrant writer from New England, the New England region, right, who does not have one of those big names. It's very important for our community, but is not, it's not Robert Frost.
But deserves one.
Not
But
yet.
yeah, and so this is what she does, and Daniela, feel free to deduct the minutes from my time, right? From my time slot.
And I have chosen to read the poem by a friend of mine named Cesar Sanchez Veras, a well-known Dominican poet. His poem is titled Areito por Todos. My English translation of it is titled Ritual Song for Us All. They tossed me away as Apache from the plains and the wind. They tossed me out as Inca from the bark of silence. But I come back from the shadow of past and future. They tossed me aside as Indian, but I return as black. They tossed me away as black from the drumbeat of hope. They denied me the sugar mill used to grind my insides. They denied me in Yoruba, in Bantu, in Karabali, but I return to the scrubland as runaway slave in white and black. They tossed me away as Jew, as Latin, as Moor. They tossed me away as Hispanic, as Gullah, as slaver. They tossed me out of the clouds where I denuded the rain. They tossed me out of the hills where I denuded the earth. But I return as Indian. I return as black. But I return in Spanish, in Yoruba, and in Taino, trekking back across the wild, trying on a new face. I come wearing the mask of those who have no country. They tossed me away, but I return. And here is the Spanish original by Cesar Sanchez Veras, Areito por Todos. Me sacaron como Apache de la llanura y del viento. Me arrojaron como Inca de la barca del silencio, pero vengo de la sombra del pasado y del futuro. Me sacaron como indio, pero vuelvo como negro. Me sacaron como negro del tambor de la esperanza. Me negaron el trapiche para moler mis adentros. Me negaron en Yoruba, en Bantú, Carabalí, pero vuelvo en la manigua cimarrón en blanco y negro. Me sacaron por judío, por latino, por moreno. Me sacaron por hispano, por guloya y por negrero. Me sacaron de las nubes donde desnudé la lluvia. Me sacaron de los montes donde desnudé la tierra. Pero vuelvo como indio, pero vuelvo como negro. Pero vuelvo en español, en yoruba y en taíno, regresando por los montes, estrenando un rostro nuevo. Vengo con el mascarón de los que no tienen patria. Me sacaron, pero vuelvo, pero vuelvo. I selected.
And then here comes what is the thinking that Rhina shares with us about her choice of this poem and how it fulfills the mission of this project, which is how the poem connects, deepens, or reimagines our sense of the nation.
Ritual Song for Us All by Cesar Sanchez Beras, a poet who was born in the Dominican Republic and, like me, has lived in the United States for many years. Why have I chosen this particular poem to read for the Poetry of America project? Well, because it deals with immigration and migration from an unusual point of view, with a passion and urgency that befits the importance of the issue, but with a breadth that humanizes and universalizes the issue, rather than narrowing it down to the interests of any one group. The speaker of the poem conveys, in his first-person narrative, the situation of the many displaced human beings who, over the centuries and into the present, have been forced by countless circumstances to leave their birthplaces and roots and begin life over somewhere else. The word areito comes from the Taíno language spoken by the native people of the Caribbean islands. It means group ritual or tribal invocation, and it suggests cultural unity, the sense of belonging that is fundamental to the traditional notion of identity. But in this poem, Sanchez Beras refers not only to the Taínos who presumably formed part of his own ancestry and mine, but also to the Apaches, the Incas, the various African people who were brought to the Americas as slaves, Yorubas, Bantus, Carabalís, and then widening the circle to include still others who have wandered the earth and settled far from home, he goes on to the Jews, the Gullahs, and by implication others from every culture. Speaking for that multitude he invokes, the speaker of the poem lists his dispossessions, his many losses. He has been denied the landscapes he once inhabited, the future, his hopes, the fruits of his labor, his liberty. But, he says, each time he is dispossessed, he returns, even if in a different guise, sometimes as the next wave of others, sometimes, ironically, as a member of the very group that once tossed him out. Even the conqueror, even the slaver, turn up in the speaker's list of guises, and rightly so, because they too are part of our history, and even, for some of us, part of our ancestry, our present families, our children, and therefore our unborn descendants. Those of us who intermarry know perfectly well that identity is not a stable construct, but an ongoing process, and that the blood of those who were once enemies is now mingled forever with our own. That knowledge and its acceptance as a reality of our national life is one of the glories of America. This poem would be a recital of fruitless travels and endless alienation if it were not for the phrases, repeated 9 times, pero vengo and pero vuelvo, meaning I come, I return. That stubborn phrase, meant to convey the natural tenacity of every living thing, transforms the poem into a challenge, a triumphal promise that man makes to himself. It seems to say, whoever I may be, however I may be perceived and treated over time, however often I may be tossed from place to place, I return in some form or other because I am indomitable. That implied statement resonates with me as the daughter of political exiles, but it applies equally well to those tossed out of their place in the world for any reason at all, be it political, religious, economic, or military. And the poem does more than that. It suggests that the human race, as the science of genetics now affirms, is one race, one huge family, linked inexorably, interdependent, whose members are destined to return from every exile, changed but persistent, and continue to braid together, unbraid and braid again, as long as we exist.
Thank you, Daniela. And that's a shout out to Daniela and the team, collaborators that she represents, that is committed to making these occasions possible. I would also like to say that I was late in printing my 5 pages, and they advised me and escorted me to a place nearby where they would make the copies, and then more copies were made by mistake. And every copy was 25 cents each of a page. And then when I was getting ready to pay, when Sebastian was with me, and they recognized Sebastian as connected with Word Up community bookstore, they say, "Oh no, if it's for that, no, that's fine." Yeah. So there, to see the love. I only wish every time I see the programs, on my email, the Word Up programs, I only wish the bus ride, the Greyhound bus ride from Syracuse were less long and a bit more comfortable. But
I want to take this opportunity just to say to people who don't know that the participants have come from across the country and Canada, and I think you didn't probably introduce yourselves, and I didn't introduce you. So this is Roberto Marquez, this is Sara Ponte, this is Silvio Torres-Sayan, and this is Leslie Mansour, came all the way from California. So just know that the people have traveled distances together.
And that is because of the love that this project elicits, I think, in the end. Yeah.
I think that you're wonderful,
Yeah.
and that I
We
wish that
agree.
you would move to Massachusetts.
She's belongs to New York.
Then my old hometown will hate me.
We'll give you Mike Bloomberg. He's from Massachusetts.
Now,
That's not a good.
now I think what you heard there in the choice of that poem by Cesar Sanchez Vera,
It was a magnificent
which is unusual. You are the only one person who has done something like that. Everybody else has chosen a poem that doesn't need to be translated, and also a poem that is penned by somebody of note, of national recognition, national, international recognition. You're the only one who have, done recovery work, as it were. Yeah. And so what I see there in the explanatory note that follows the reciting of the poem is a theory of translation, or not more a theory, but an ethos of translation that has much to do with that original etymology, of the word, a carrying over, right? A transfer, yeah, a building of bridges, yeah. So there's much in Rhina Espaillat's exceptional body of work that urges us to reflect on translation as a craft, a mode of cultural mediation, a vehicle for navigating oceans of difference, a worldview, and a trope for speaking about the poetic act, applicable even when monolingual poets write verse in their own mother tongue. Or as Leslie would say, speaking of Rhina's mother tongue, which presumably is Spanish, but since it was the language that she could more comfortably speak with her mother, as opposed to with her father, with whom she had to speak Spanish, yeah, then it can be called metaphorically also her mother tongue, yeah. Apart from her renown as one of the greatest living poets in the English language, Espaillat enjoys a considerable reputation as a first-rate translator of the works of other poets. she has produced memorable English versions of a substantial volume of verse written originally in Spanish and Portuguese by Iberian and Latin American bards. Taking stock of the accomplishments of First Things, the influential journal of religion and public life, on its 20th anniversary, editor Joseph Bottom, is that the name, the pronunciation?
Joseph Bottom.
Yes.
Yes. He highlighted among the publication's milestones over those first decades of its existence is having opened its pages to, I quote, a great deal of translation. And in so doing, Bottom took special care to mention the extraordinary renditions of John of the Cross by Rhina Espaillat, which he proceeded to illustrate by citing several stanzas from a spiritual canticle of the soul and the bridegroom Christ, Espaillat's version of El Famoso Cántico Espiritual, a beloved devotional poem by the 16th century Spanish poet San Juan de la Cruz, the Carmelite friar, known among other things for his strong collaboration with the great Spanish mystic Santa Teresa de Jesús. The journal First Things published Espaillat's renditions of the compelling verse of San Juan de la Cruz and its June 2003 issue, a collaboration that would continue for several issues after that. The poet Timothy Murphy, I believe the late poet, unfortunately now, a great admirer of Espaillat's own Anglophone poetry, who emphatically went on to declare her work superior to that of Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton, attested to the personal impact that her English versions of San Juan de la Cruz's poems had on him as a reader when they began appearing in First Things during, as he says, the bleakest days early in this century. Imagine the state of mind triggered by the 9/11 incidents. Yeah? Beyond the 16th century, Espaillat's translations of poetry into English encompass poems by the feisty Hieronymite nun from 17th century Mexico, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, and a fine gathering of lyrical and narrative verse from across various historical periods in Iberian and Latin American letters, and especially the writings of Dominican immigrant poets in the United States who use Spanish as their literary language. She has translated poems by renowned Spaniards whom we heard before, Miguel de Unamuno, Miguel Hernandez, Blas de Otero, the Latin Americans of the caliber of Vicente Huidobro, among the Dominicans, Manuel del Cabral, Héctor Inchaustegui Cabral, and among others, of course. Espaillat's translation work received significantly coverage in the Christmas 2012 issue of the Sewanee Theological Review, which published a sizable share of her English versions of Iberian and Latin American poems. The year before, the spring issue of the Hudson Review, which was dedicated to translation, had welcomed a generous sampling of her English versions of Spanish originals. And when Hudson Review editor Paula Dietz, who I think I recognize here, put together the magnificent volume Poets Translate Poets, published by Syracuse University Press, Espaillat's work of translation would unsurprisingly appear well represented in its pages. As a poet committed to translating other poets, Espaillat exhibits a feature that sets her apart from other major American poets interested in translation, including Richard Wilbur and so on. Namely, her resolve to promote through English translation the literary production of immigrant writers from her land of birth who are active practitioners of the poetic craft in their native language in the United States, which is a bit more of a thankless job at this point in our history, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? It is in this vein that in addition to producing English versions of individual poems by such New York-based Dominican compatriots, such as Diogenes Abreu and Dagoberto Lopez, Espaillat has translated whole volumes of verse by Cesar Sanchez Veras, such as Trovas del Mar, Troves of the Sea, and by Juan Matos, el hombre que se, chiefly el hombre que se fue, the man who left. Her incursion into translation from English into her native language has also yielded book-length publications from English into Spanish, right? Book-length publications, particularly a collection of 42 poems selected from the oeuvre of the renowned American poet Richard Wilbur, entitled Oscura Fruta, 42 poemas, 42, what is it, dark berries, 42 poems, with a preface, with a preface by Leslie, yeah. And another volume entitled Algo hay que no es amigo de los muros, something there is that doesn't love a wall, by a relatively well-known American poet.
He's not bad.
Robert, and also a beloved, unconditionally beloved of Rhina's, Robert Frost. Now, in 2001, Rhina was the co-founder with her New England-based Dominican compatriots and poetic accomplices, Cesar and Juan Matos, of the Pedro Mir Tertulia, or reading series, chiefly a project based in Lawrence with the mission to promote Hispanic letters in the region, for which they recruited her, and she was very happy to come in and serve as chair of the board of the organization. And she brought with her all of the resources connected with her leadership, her leadership role in the Power River Poets, as well as the Newburyport Art Association, to enable the Tertulia to pursue a de facto cultural exchange mission, which entailed fostering conversation about literary exchange and communication between English-speaking and Spanish-speaking creative writers across their corresponding heritages and traditions, in addition to across languages. Yeah. So to me, that actually is translation at a larger, at a larger level, right? It's a carrying across. Yeah. It's creating the physical conditions for communication across difference. Translation would, of course, play a key role in these cross-cultural conversations, and Espaillat, prime mover of the mediation effort, would find herself busy at work facilitating when Hispanophone authors from the other side, from the Tertulia, came as guest readers to the literary events hosted by the Newburyport Art Association, as well as when members of the Power River Poets went over to Lawrence as guest readers in Tertulia Pedro Mir events. Yeah, and I can imagine the effort, the practical. So translation in the way I'm understanding it is part of a vision here that does not entail simply setting down with foreign words on the page and transferring them from one language to another, creating some structural conditions, right, that enable the communication across languages. So there is something we all know about the inherently translational nature of poetry, which Rhina has spoken about, and the idea that all poetry is inevitably bilingual. As we learned from that often quoted afterward to the Where Horizons Go, right? Strikingly, a preface, an afterword that actually appears since Nancy and I had to do the scanning of the bibliography. We found the very, very frequent, the high frequency with which the ideas about poetry and translation, or poetry as translation, the high frequency with which those ideas are cited by poets of various ethnicities, yeah, who are not connected necessarily with Spanish. And of course, she expands on this notion in that essay that Roberto has quoted before, the shared art of writing backwards, yeah, which the whole idea is almost as if you have two minds speaking speaking two languages. One the person using the feelings and the words in ordinary ways, right? And then the other person, the other speaker, right, who actually says, yeah, that's kind of true, but how poetic is it?
Don't say it, sing it.
Yeah.
Right.
That's what the voice says to me.
Yeah.
Don't say it, sing
So, and so there's also in the way in which their poetry for Rhina has this eminently capacity to translate, even across words, even beyond words. And so I'm thinking of the story she tells of the lady in her primarily Anglophone public reading, yeah? In which she included, which as has been her practice, irrespective of whether or not there's any Spanish-speaking members in the audience, to include one or two poems in Spanish. Yeah? And then there's this lady who approaches her to say how moved she was by that Spanish poem that Rhina had recited, and Rhina said, "Oh, so where did you learn Spanish?" And she said, "Oh no, I don't know Spanish. I was just taken by the music. It was something I understood." So it's almost as if they said that the elements she imbues in her vision. She imbues poetry with the capacity to communicate beyond words. Yeah. And so, so hers is a humane ethos of translation, which is committed to imagining communication in the best possible ways, right? And communication with the best intention, and that of course is powered by a vision of languages as fundamentally equal. Yeah, languages that are no great languages and lesser languages, yeah? Which is actually something that, unfortunately, one does not find in William Carlos Williams when he speaks about Spanish. And William Carlos Williams speaks of having discovered some Spanish literary traditions, medieval, cancioneros, and how we can use these resources to strengthen our utterances. Basically, using those literary traditions as raw material to strengthen their own possibilities in English.
Don't
And
get
then
me
say,
started on William Carlos Williams.
but don't get me started either, because he actually says that Spanish, it's not really a poetic language. Yeah. So let's not go there. So and so I just close by saying, because Daniela was supposed to stop me when I went over, and I have to stop myself, right? So we can have a break, yeah. So I'm taken by and the fact that her translation work has been recognized, right, through several awards, yeah, including the Frost Foundation's award, the Tree at My Window, and there's the Westchester Poetry Center that it began that Rhina Espaillat Poetry Award, which is given to somebody who has excelled at translation, translating a poem from another language. Yeah. So I'm taken by going back then to the website of the Library of Congress. She remembers more quickly because she's a librarian. You go to the Rhina page, and what is the first thing that pops up, right? What is the poem that represents her? No, it's translation. Translation. A poem called Translation, which basically dramatizes the speaker's role as mediator, as relatives come from the old country, they're wrestling with English, and then she is actually serving as a kind of go-between. But it's mostly cultural and psychological, so they will find the words less harsh. Yes, and so there's that. But I would like to just close by saying, so it begins with the cousins. Cousins come from home. Cousins from home are practicing their English. But I like to close with a part with the one part where it says that. So I want to tell them, to tell the cousins who are visiting from home, to help them more, be more at ease with this environment and this strange sounding language. Yeah, I want to tell them the goodness of people who seldom touch, who bring covered dishes to the bereaved in embarrassed silence, who teach me daily that all dialogue is reverie, is hearsay, is translation. Thank you.
Well, I want to say first that I'm extremely grateful and honored and happy to be included in this erudite, eloquent, scholarly, kick-ass love fest for Rhina Espaillat. I want to talk today about one poem in particular that Rhina translated. First, I'll make some other remarks, but it's Robert Frost. From her two bilingual editions, one of Richard Wilbur and one of Robert Frost, which unfortunately are not here today. I mean, the books aren't here today. But it's a long story, why that happened. But I'll just, I want to show how important the subtle choices of words are, and I'll get to it in one of Robert Frost's most well-known poems, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. So there's some handouts to show these translations I'm going to talk about a little bit. Oh, and I didn't get the idea that there would be simultaneous interpretation, and I prepared my own Spanish, which I think I might be able to skip some of it. I don't know if it's necessary, but I'll probably go through most of it. And as then I said to Mariela, that hope no one thinks I'm showing off like some of the Democratic presidential candidates do in the debate. Yeah. Okay. Well, when Rhina first told me that she had translated these poems by Robert Frost, 44 of them? Is that how many in the?
I think it's 42.
Yeah, 42 of Wilbur's, maybe it's 42 of Frost too.
It's 40 of Frost. 40.
Oh, okay, 40. Well, anyway, I mean, I was not only astonished because of the extraordinary challenge of that task, but I also thought, lucky Frost. And I'd like to read what I wrote about Rhina's translations of Richard Wilbur's poems, because the same applies to her translations of Robert Frost. Seldom have the works of a modern American poet of Richard Wilbur's or Robert Frost's stature been introduced to the Spanish-speaking world with so little lost in translation. It is a lucky circumstance that in Rhina Espaillat we have a Dominican-born writer, raised and educated in the United States, who is a superior poet herself, both in English and in her native Spanish, and in possession of exactly the right combination of literary qualities to execute her faithful transformations with the beauty and success embodied here, if only we had the book. There are several reasons for her success. First of all, Rhina knows the poems well. They are important and influential in her life. as she wrote in her own introduction to her Frost translations. I've loved the poems of Robert Frost since my first encounters with them at school. Their language is deceptively conversational, but more artful and genuinely musical than much that strains to appear so. I was drawn to translate them because I love them and want Spanish-speaking readers who can't enjoy the unique originals to have at least a sense of those originals, a view of them through the smoked glass of another language. Cuando Rhina me contó que había traducido todos estos poemas de Robert Frost, me quedé asombrada porque es un empeño bien difícil, pero también me dije dichoso de Frost. Quiero leerles lo que escribí sobre las traducciones que Rhina hizo de los poemas de Richard Wilbur, porque lo mismo se puede decir sobre sus traducciones de Robert Frost. Y gracias, Rhina, por traducir lo que yo escribí. Pocas veces se le ha brindado al público hispanoparlante las obras de un poeta del rango de Richard Wilbur o Robert Frost con tan poca pérdida en el tránsito de un idioma al otro. Afortunadamente tenemos en Rhina Espaillat una poeta nacida en la República Dominicana, educada en los Estados Unidos, autora notable tanto en inglés como en su primer idioma y dotada de las cualidades literarias que le han permitido lograr con éxito y belleza las precisas transformaciones que aquí se encuentran. And then I'll read the introduction Rhina wrote to Robert Frost. Me enamoré de las obras de Robert Frost desde que en la escuela las descubrí. Su lenguaje es engañosamente parecido a la conversación, pero esquivo en su apariencia de sencillez y con una musicalidad innata que no logran muchos de quienes se esfuerzan en ello. He querido traducirlos porque me gustan y deseo brindar a aquellos lectores hispanoparlantes que no pueden disfrutar los originales algún sentido de estos poemas, un vistazo de lo que contienen, aunque sea por el cristal ahumado de otro idioma. También Rhina sabe habitar los poemas como un actor sabe desaparecerse en su carácter. Cuando la preguntaron sobre sus traducciones, ¿qué es lo más importante de retener del original? Rhina respondió: para mí es la relación entre el sonido, las imágenes y el pensamiento. Además, no puedes hacerte visible en una traducción. Es necesario desaparecer lo más que posible. Cuando yo acabo traduciendo un poema escrito por otro, me pregunto, ¿hay algo mío aquí que se ha colado en mi traducción? Rhina understands how to inhabit a poem the way an actor disappears into her role or her character. When she was asked about her translations during an interview, what is the most important thing to retain in the original, she responded, for me, it's the relationship between the sound, the imagery, and the thought. Furthermore, you can't be seen in a translation. You have to be as transparent as possible. I think the translator should disappear. And when I finish a poem that is by somebody else, I say, now is there any of me that has sneaked into this? And you have to watch for that. That interview was in the winter 2012 issue of the journal Rattle. Finally, Rhina's are the only translations I know of that faithfully preserve the rhyme and meter of the originals. I've never seen this done before. All the Frost translations I've ever come across have been in free verse, and Frost never wrote that way. As Rhina said to her interviewer, I don't like translations that betray the form of the original. I cannot stand free verse translations of metrical poetry. Finalmente, las traducciones de Rhina Espaillat preservan la rima y la métrica de los originales, y yo nunca he visto eso. Todas las traducciones que yo he encontrado fueron hechas en verso libre, algo que Frost nunca empleó. Como dijo Rhina a su entrevistador, no me gustan las traducciones que traicionan la forma del original. No puedo soportar el uso de verso libre en traducciones de la poesía métrica. Entonces voy a empezar con Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening y cómo conquistó Rhina los retos de traducir este poema tan universalmente bien conocido. Bueno, en su introducción, Rhina explica su problema con la métrica poética de Stopping by Woods y cómo llegó a su decisión de usar líneas con 11 sílabos, o sea, endecasílabos, con 3 o 4 acentos tónicos en cada línea. Rhina dice, la primera frase, whose woods these are, con sus 4 palabras que dicen tanto, me mostraron una diferencia importante entre mis dos idiomas y la dificultad de transferir la percusión lacónica de uno al otro, que se muestra al contrario, líquido, ondulante y musical. Afortunadamente, los iambos sueltos preferidos de Frost se parecen mucho más al sonido de la prosodia hispánica que, por ejemplo, las breves líneas staccato de Emily Dickinson. So we'll look at Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening and how Rhina overcame the challenges of translating this universally well-known poem. In her introduction, Rhina explains her approach to Stopping by Woods. She talks about her failure to render the poem in octosyllabic lines, or Frost's iambic tetrameter. The very first phrase, Rhina wrote in her introduction, the very first phrase, whose woods these are, taught me an important difference between my two languages and the difficulty of conveying the percussive terseness of one in the liquid, rippling musicality of the other. The meter I finally settled on, and all translation is settling on and for, is hendecasyllables, or 11 syllables, with 3 or 4 stresses per line. Luckily for me, the loose iambics advocated by Frost are much closer in sound to the syllabic prosody of Spanish than, say, the short staccato lines of Emily Dickinson. I know we all know this poem, but let's hear it in English first.
We don't all know it.
Yeah, okay. Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think without a farmhouse near. Between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. And here, I think it might be on the other side of the verso of this. It's not Rhina's, but one I got off the internet. Nomás para comparar, just to compare. The Casa Digital, which means website, I guess. Casa Digital de Luis López Nieves. He's an author and a translator. Alto en el bosque en una noche de invierno. Me imagino de quién son estos bosques, pero en el pueblo su casa se encuentra. No me verá parada en este sitio ante sus bosques cubiertos de nieve. Mi pequeño caballo encuentra insólito parar aquí, sin ninguna alquería, entre el helado lago y estos bosques, en la noche más lóbrega del año. Las campanillas del arnés sacude como si presintiera que ocurre algo. Solo se oye otro son, el sigiloso paso del viento entre los copos blandos. Qué bellos son los bosques y sombríos, pero tengo promesas que cumplir, y andar mucho camino sin dormir, y andar mucho camino sin dormir. Bueno, pues no es mal, it's not a bad translation, pero me falta la música, la esquema de rima, the rhyme scheme, excepto the last 3 lines. Sí, pero no es mal. Pero aquí es la de Rhina. Al detenerse ante un bosque durante una noche nevosa. Este bosque creo saber de quién será. Su casa está en la aldea. No me verá detenerme ante su bosque silencioso, viendo la nieve que al fin lo colmará. Sin duda mi potrillo está curioso, tan lejos de la granja, al verse ocioso, entre este bosque y ese lago helado, en el nadir del año tenebroso. Se sacude, el arreo cascabelado tintinea como un decir, amo, ¿has cerrado? Y no hay otro sonido que el pequeño silbar de viento suave y copo alado. El bosque es bello, oscuro, hondo, halagüeño, pero di mi palabra y tengo empeño. Y hay millas por viajar antes del sueño. Y hay millas por viajar antes del sueño. Pues quería empezar con el título, Noche Nevosa. Este autor Nieves no usó nevosa, usó una noche de invierno. He used a winter night instead of a snowy evening. But noche nevosa sugiere noche nerviosa. Y aunque en el poema la noche parece tranquila, se sabe que Robert Frost no fue un hombre tranquilo. Y esta noche nevosa ocurre en el nadir, el punto más bajo del año tenebroso. In the title, Rhina's use of nevosa for noche nevosa, snowy evening, suggests noche nerviosa to my ear a little bit, which would translate to stopping by woods on a nervous evening. And frankly, that suggestion might be considered apt when it comes to Robert Frost, if nervous could also be construed as despondent, pessimistic, or unhappy. And after all, it is the darkest evening of the year. And bueno, and en la primera línea del segundo verso, the first line of the second verse, sin duda mi potrillo está curioso. Frost dice my little horse, que se traduce como mi caballito o mi caballo pequeño, pero Rhina ha escogido potrillo, que a mí me parece una palabra más animada y más poética. Potrillo curioso, tiene mucho más música. En su traducción también Rhina da voz y presencia al potrillo, que cuando se sacude y se oye el arreo cascabelado, tintinea como un decir, amo, ¿has cerrado? Y así se adhiere el poema al esquema de rima ya prominentemente establecido con cascabelado y alado. Y no se debe olvidar sonido, imagen y pensamiento. Rhina chose Mi Potrillo for My Little Horse, and her choice adds to the musicality of her translation into Spanish. Potrillo translates to colt in English, and the sound in Spanish gives more life and musicality to the line, I think. Also, in the third stanza, Rhina translates, he gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake, into the voice of the colt, saying he gives his harness bells a shake as if to ask, Master, have you made a mistake? Which is charming, and it keeps the rhyme scheme going. And remember, it's sound, image, and thought that are important and points in translation. Llegamos al verso final. En la primera línea, Frost usa 3 adjetivos en su descripción del bosque. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep. Pero Rhina nos da 4 adjetivos y una línea verdaderamente musical, legato y sostenuto. El bosque es bello, oscuro, hondo, halagüeño. Halagüeño es una palabra maravillosa que sirve darnos una contradicción con oscuro y hondo, porque algo oscuro y hondo no es necesariamente bello ni halagüeño, o sea, tentador, atractivo o seductor. Pero se sabe que Robert Frost fue un hombre a veces deprimido y tal vez con deseos suicidas. Así es que para una persona que se encuentra cansado, deprimido, tal vez contemplando la muerte, un bosque que se ve oscuro y hondo también le puede parecer como la muerte en ese momento atractivo y tentador. Robert Frost's final stanza begins with the even flowing tempo of his 4 iambs and 3 adjectives. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep. But Rhina in her translation gives us not 3 but 4 adjectives and a longer line that flows in what we might call in musical terms a legato or sostenuto. El bosque es bello, oscuro, hondo, halagüeño. It lingers. Halagüeño is a marvelous word to add to lovely, dark, and deep because it means alluring or tempting. And we know that Frost had depressive tendencies, perhaps even suicidal, and in this case it's only natural to think how the woods, so dark and deep, might seem lovely to someone who is weary, depressed, perhaps contemplating death and finding it attractive or tempting at that moment. Regarding the final repeated line, and miles to go before I sleep, it's fortunate in Spanish that sleep and dream are interchangeable. For instance, I am sleepy translates to tengo sueño. At the same time, I had a dream last night translates to anoche tuve un sueño. It's a poetic word choice when you think about it. In Spanish, one can be both sleep deprived and dream deprived with one word, same word. Bueno, en español, sueño y dormir son casi intercambiables. Por ejemplo, necesito sueño quiere decir necesito dormir. Pero tener un sueño no es lo mismo que dormir. En inglés, sleep es dormir y dream es sueño o soñar, no son mismos. Aunque Robert Frost dice miles to go before I sleep, o sea, millas por viajar antes de dormir, Rhina escogió sueño en vez de dormir, no solamente para completar el esquema de rima, pero también porque sueño tiene sonido y significado mucho más poético. En fin, cada vez que me disfruto con estas maravillosas traducciones de los poemas de Richard Wilbur y Robert Frost, Rina me hace darme cuenta de nuevo cuánto me encantan no solamente estos dos poetas, pero también estos dos idiomas. Finally, each time I enjoy myself with these marvelous translations of Richard Wilbur and Robert Frost. Rina gives me a fresh sense of why I love not only these two great poets, but these two great languages.
May I make a confession?
No,
I have a couple of confessions to make very briefly, but you know how sometimes the truth attacks you from inside. I have been made to sound so great here today that I'm floating on air. I will never step on the ground again. But I do have to tell the truth. This translation has cheating in it. It has cheating in it because I could not take a shoehorn and put the English meaning into the Spanish. I just could not, because Spanish is very fluid and lovely and loose, and it's like us, in other words, you know. We're charming and delightful and very and fond of talking.
Except when we're not.
Except when we're not, which happens once in a blue moon, right? But English is effective. English is get there and say it. I love the language because it's strong and it knows its job. But you have to use a shoehorn to get it into the other kind of Latinate language. So I could not do it in 8 syllables. I tried every which way. It took me weeks just to get that opening line. Because whose house, de quien es la casa? Look at the difference in the number of syllables. Whose house is 2 lousy, skinny little syllables. You can't do that in Spanish. La casa de quien? El dueño de la casa, ¿quién es? Too much. So the whole poem is like that, line after line. And I was not going to write something telegraphic because that's ugly. You can squeeze it by all sorts of things that amateur poets do, which is like taking out the thes and the as and the, you know, they take out all the articles, which sounds like a bad telegram, and it's awful. So I said, well, I'm going to have to commit a sin here. I will have to add something that is not in the poem, and that's the extra 3 syllables per line. So I hope Frost forgave me, but that's how I did it. And the other thing was that line about the little horse that you like so much, confession number 2. I could not get the indirect quote in. I had to make it a direct quote because I saved syllables that way.
but it worked.
Of course it worked. And that's the whole point, that when you translate, you do what works. You don't do what's going to stand out like a sore thumb and say, here I am, somebody squeeze me in. You do what works, even if it means a tiny sin. But it has to be a tiny sin. And it has to be the kind of sin that is measurable in syllables, but does not change the sense of what is being said. That's it. Or the feeling. So now, am I forgiven?
Yo te felicito porque yo soy una de las que creo que los sentimientos y las emociones no se pueden traducir. Y tú lo sabes hacer muy bien. Porque parece que tú tienes un dominio de los 2 idiomas que es increíble.
Bueno, eso es porque tuve la suerte de venir muy joven y crecí con los dos, crecí pensando en los dos. Pero también hay que respetar y amar los dos. Eso es parte del problema, que muchos traductores no sienten lo mismo para el otro idioma. Hay que sentir igual hacia los dos. Por eso no me gusta el Spanish. Here he comes, he's going to fight with me now. No puedo.
It's the only area in which, this is the only area in which Rhina can show some tiny signs of
Sword comes
fundamentalism.
out. Sword comes out. Because I think that languages are so beautiful, just as they are. They are so worthy of respect and admiration that you should not tinker with their guts. And when you throw a word from language A into language B, you are not adding to it, you are subtracting from it by killing off a word that already exists in it. I have heard so many times people say, abre la window. It makes me sick, because we already have ventana. We already have ventana. How can you get rid of a perfectly good Spanish word by substituting one that we don't need? And the same is true going in the other direction. You must respect the vocabulary of both languages, because those vocabularies make the music of the language.
I am going to interspace here and make my own confession. I agree with entirely everything. Okay, you do need to respect absolutely both languages and the personalities that are involved, because those personalities are the history of that language. Okay. On the other hand, precisely because they are the history of that language can, over time, okay, change. Okay, and not only change, but be pushed to change. The same way Spanish pushed Latin to change, the same way Italian pushed Latin to change. Okay, any language that is both vibrant and alive and has enough people behind it, okay, is worthy of respect. Okay, and a recognition of precisely the mortality of languages themselves.
Yes, of course. We know that they have to change because they're living things. They're not
Yeah,
dead. Languages
exactly.
are alive, the way the arts are alive. But you don't plug something in where there is no hole. Now, we had to give English the word patio. They didn't have it. They had veranda, they had backyard, but that's not the same space. We gave them patio. We gave them rodeo. We gave them canoa, which is, by the way, Taino word.
Yeah.
So that's fine. When you find a hole, you say, oops, I've got to fill this with something that works, so you do. But you don't take out something that is already in the hole and works and put in a substitute. Sorry.
How about this? Let me quote.
You knew there was going to be a fight.
Let me quote you back to you.
Okay.
Back to yourself. How does that vision? How does the vision?
Sorts out.
How does that vision, right? Of that kind of sacredness of intact, living it intact, right? How does it? How can that fit in the same heart, right? As the heart in which you say that no language has all that it needs to express what we need to express.
Well, of course, no language has all that it needs, which is why languages need to be permitted to change. But you don't force the change. You provide the change because it's needed.
But it doesn't quite happen that way, because in the sense, what I mean by that is, no individual person says to any other individual person, this is the word must go here. Okay. This is the word must go there. No, this happens as a process of living over time. Okay. And it is true that at any given moment, there may be what you call the boquete.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
El boquete, wonderful word.
Yeah.
I would hate to see it disappear.
Yeah, but that's my point. That you may have as many as 12 words for any given situation in both languages.
Yes.
And the coming of a 13th, okay, does not diminish that language, okay? But if you've got enough force, history, social, and otherwise, okay, that will make that 13th word compete successfully with the others, no problem.
I'll tell you why that's a problem. Because our young people who are growing up bilingual here know both languages, but what are they surrounded by? They're surrounded by the richest language in the world. That's what English is. Wait a minute, I'm not finished. The richest language in the world surrounds them, and that's what they hear every day, no matter where they are. Now, if they are accustomed to say parquear, voy a parquear el carro.
Yeah.
They're going to forget estacionar, which is a perfectly
Bueno.
fine use of
But if you go to Spain,
Aparcar.
you will hear aparcar.
But you know,
Okay? And it is as accepted in Spain
Yes.
as any other, another
But the
case.
Spaniards chickened out.
No, it's another case. We're talking about the kind of purity of a Spanish and the integrity of a given Spanish. Bueno, let's take Spain. The word is
I'll take Spain any
Okay,
day.
and so will I. The word is singular today, Spain. It used to be plural. Its experience is actually plural. So that if you go to Madrid, you will hear Castellano. Okay, but you go to Andalusia, and you will hear Andaluz. They are both Spanish, and neither the madrileño ni el andaluz, okay, will not understand each other, even emotionally, except at certain really deep levels, because of lo gitano y todo lo que tú quieras. You know. But what I'm getting at here is that languages, multiple or single languages, that's why I said even your own language is not one language. None of us speak one language. All of us speak multiple languages. We speak the language when we go home, papi such and this, or mom, or whatever, okay? Then we speak our work language. If if you work at a given particular kind of work, you have your own vocabulary, okay? And so on.
That's
So,
a different problem.
no, it's not a different problem. It's not a different problem in the sense that if you write a poem about a carpenter, and the carpenter's vocabulary is unfamiliar to you, you have a hell of a problem.
You get a big fat dictionary.
Exactly, but you still have a problem, because it's not just what, dictionaries are the repository of dead words.
I know.
No.
I have to say something about the dictionary.
No, eso no es lo que digo yo, eso no es lo que digo yo.
Voy al fin.
Obviously, I lighted the bomb. But it's a metaphor. No, eso es metáfora.
Sí, hay una pregunta.
I just wanted to make trouble. I didn't want to end the point.
No, this is great.
And I want to make a point too about the dictionary. You look up patio in Webster's dictionary, and it says an inner court open to the sky. And there is no synonym. That's the definition. And then if for instance, the word website, new words. How do you say that? When mira mi website, no, and I just ran across it. Casa digital, my digital home is my website.
That suits me just
Sí,
fine.
¿verdad?
Mejor que sitio web.
We have a question from someone who hasn't spoken.
Okay, somebody was not spoken.
Hold on, in the front row.
Okay. Let's go. Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
you take over.
I support Daniela's. Okay. Go ahead.
Ella va primero.
Esta tarde ha sido tan rica, tan hermosa, que hay muchísimas cosas. Yo quisiera decir muchas cosas. Yo he tenido la suerte de compartir con doña Rhina y discutir la última vez que nos vimos, la traducción que estaba haciendo. Yo quiero decir que mirando, yo no soy versada en inglés, yo leo muy elemental, ¿no? Pero leyendo los dos poemas, yo estoy muy de acuerdo con la exposición de ella, porque la riqueza que adquiere este poema es increíble, la musicalidad. Yo creo mucho, como poeta, yo creo mucho en la musicalidad interna del poema, que no tiene la otra traducción y la de Freud. Sin embargo, la suya gana esa belleza interior, esa musicalidad, ¿no? Entonces, en torno a eso yo tengo dos preguntas. Yo noto en la traducción que sí hay alguna cosa de esa, que usted dice, ¿estaré yo en el poema? Sí. Yo creo que sí.
Ahí está bien metida, Rina.
Ahí está.
Ahí está bien metida.
Rina May no puede estar lejos de este poema. Ella está aquí.
Bueno, yo puse el caballito.
Si no, entonces ustedes no conocen las traducciones de Rina May. Y las dos preguntas. Después de traducir y usted releer lo que traduce, ¿usted encuentra algo suyo de lo que se niega?
Oh, yo trato de no encontrar nada mío. Y si lo encuentro, trato de borrarlo, de sacarlo, de quitarlo, de hacer otra cosa, porque yo no quiero obligarme a estar en ese poema que no es mío. No tengo derecho de aparecer en ese poema. Yo quiero ser como un vidrio completamente transparente. Porque me parece que esa es la obra del traductor. Pero a veces, cuando uno hace un pequeño cambio como ese del potrillo, es que no encontré otra manera. Si hubiera encontrado la manera, no lo hice por humanizar al caballito. Eso fue un accidente.
Por la esquema del Lima, ¿no?
Exacto, porque los accidentes pasan y a veces son muy buenos. Pero lo hice porque no encontraba otra manera de expresar lo que estaba pensando el caballito.
Y la
Pero
otra,
para mí es un error en el poema, pero es un error inevitable.
que lo enriquece muchísimo.
Accidentalmente.
La otra es, yo sé que usted ha traducido muchísimas poetas de mi generación, de la diáspora, muy buenos poetas.
Es un orgullo mío.
De esos poetas jóvenes que usted ha traducido, ¿cuál ha sido el más difícil? ¿Cuál es el que
¿Dónde está?
se me fue porque veo por ahí?
Juan.
No, Juan. Él sabía.
Él no sabía que yo le iba a preguntar eso, pero yo sabía que me iba a decir que era Jimmy.
Jimmy es el poeta más difícil que yo he traducido en la vida, en cualquier idioma, porque tiene una inteligencia que es como un fuego.